The great hall of the Galactic Council shimmered with polished stone and the soft glow of suspended crystals that illuminated the faces of dozens of alien delegates. Each species had once attempted the same ordeal that was about to begin, and each had failed in their own way. The survival simulation was not a mere game or training ground. It was the harshest test the galaxy could design, created to last years of real time, a labyrinth of changing environments, deadly predators, artificial famine, and storms that could tear apart entire camps. The test had been engineered so that endurance alone was not enough. Strategy was not enough. Strength was not enough. Only the combination of every survival trait ever known could allow someone to last more than a handful of months, and yet no being had ever lasted more than a few weeks. This was why the council members leaned forward in curiosity and disbelief when they saw the small figure of a human named Alex step into the chamber. The announcer, a tall insectoid scholar with shimmering wings, explained for the 1,000th time the purpose of the trial. It was designed to break arrogance and prove the limits of intelligence. Every civilization had offered their finest warriors, their brightest tacticians, their most resilient explorers, and every one of them had eventually begged to be pulled from the ordeal. Many species even feared volunteering again because the memory of their broken champions haunted them. Yet here was humanity, new to the council, still considered reckless and primitive by many, sending one of their own with the calm expression of someone about to play a sport rather than enter a nightmare. Alex stood silently as the instructions were repeated. He carried no weapons and no food. The simulation would strip him of everything but the clothes on his back. Once inside, hours outside could become days inside, and the landscapes would shift at random. It was said that the designers had created the system so perfectly that not even they could predict how one might last. Alex only nodded once and stepped forward into the glowing doorway. The light swallowed him whole and the hall erupted in murmurs of disbelief. Inside the simulation, Alex opened his eyes to a barren desert stretching in all directions. The sun above was merciless, burning down on cracked ground that offered no sign of water. Heat shimmered on the horizon, distorting the air. The instinct of many challengers had been to wander aimlessly in search of shade, but Alex crouched low, scooped up sand, and let it slip through his fingers. He studied the wind, direction, and spotted faint ridges, clues that the designers might not have expected anyone to notice so quickly. He chose a path not toward the shimmering horizon, but toward a low depression where the ridges curved, reasoning that even an artificial desert had to simulate runoff. Hours passed, but Alex found what he sought, a cluster of strange thorned plants, with thick roots buried deep. He broke a stem and found liquid within. He did not drink recklessly. He stored the knowledge and marked the plants with small stone piles so he could return. Already he was mapping. Already he was treating the impossible simulation as a puzzle to be solved, rather than a torment to be endured. Meanwhile, back in the council chamber, the monitors displayed his every movement. The alien scientists whispered to each other as they recognized his choices. The lizard-like commander from the Zarketh species hissed that the human should have collapsed by now. Yet instead, he was moving methodically, leaving signs for himself, creating a path of logic in chaos. The insectoid scholar raised one delicate hand and murmured that this was only the beginning. The simulation shifted suddenly. The desert cracked apart and reformed into a dense jungle filled with buzzing predators and dripping humidity. Many, before, had wasted precious energy fighting the creatures or panicking at the sudden change. Alex simply paused, crouched again, and listened. He noticed that the buzzing predators followed a pattern, circling fruit trees. Where there was fruit, there was nourishment. He moved not with fear, but with curiosity, plucking only what he needed and fashioning a crude sling from his shirt to carry more. By the time the alien observers expected exhaustion to set in, Alex was already adapting to the second environment. Hours ticked by outside, yet inside the simulation, Alex felt time pressing hard. He built a small shelter of broad leaves and branches, placed fruit high out of reach of ground dwellers, and created a rhythm of movement that preserved his strength. The alien audience leaned closer, unsettled. None of their own champions had ever moved with such calm, such analysis. They had all treated the ordeal as endless torment. But the human treated it like a puzzle that had an answer. When the cycle of night fell in the simulation, Alex lay beneath his leaf shelter, his mind racing not with fear but with calculation. He had already spotted loopholes in the design. The fruit trees regenerated too quickly, the predators followed too strict a pattern, and the shelter materials were too abundant. It was not just a test of endurance. It was a system that could be understood, and then bent to his will. He smiled faintly to himself, unseen by the watchers, and whispered that he would not just survive this trial, he would master it. Outside, the council chamber fell silent as the timer continued its relentless count upward. No one had expected the human to last more than a handful of hours in the first stage. Yet already he was proving that humanity did not play by the same rules. And as the night deepened inside the simulation, the galaxy's most arrogant trial had just met a mind that refused to break. The morning cycle of the simulation broke with a mist rising across the jungle floor and the sound of distant roars echoing from somewhere deep in the trees. Alex stirred awake inside the simple shelter he had built from broad leaves and woven branches. His body was sore from the hard ground, but his mind was sharp, and he immediately began to test the edges of his environment. He tasted the fruit he had gathered the night before, careful to chew slowly and observe how his stomach reacted. It was edible, though bitter, and he stored the seeds in a small pouch made from torn cloth. He had a thought that even in this artificial world, a seed might still grow if given time, and such growth could be manipulated. He marked this idea away for later use, already treating the entire simulation as a system waiting to be cracked. As the mist cleared, Alex explored further, noting the strange design of the predators that circled the fruit trees. They were large, insect-like creatures with armored bodies, long wings that buzzed like saws, and sharp stingers that could pierce through even stone. Most challengers before him had wasted their energy fighting them or running in terror. Alex crouched behind the roots of an ancient tree and studied them. They followed paths in the air, always circling the same number of times before diving. He picked up a fallen branch, tied a piece of fruit to it, and placed it far from his shelter. When the predators dived toward the bait, he noted the rhythm of their attack and discovered that they moved in pairs, never alone. With this knowledge, he could create distractions, drawing them away from where he wanted to move. Back in the council chamber, the alien scientists watched the display with growing unease. They murmured to one another as the human marked the air with his hands, counting intervals of time and setting up traps that used no weapons but pure observation. One scholar pointed out that he was building a system of understanding faster than any species before him. Another scoffed, insisting it was only luck. Yet the timer on the great screen continued to advance, and no one could deny that Alex was turning the impossible into something manageable. By midday, the simulation shifted again. The jungle faded, the ground trembling until it reformed into a frozen tundra where the wind cut like knives. Snow whipped across his face and ice shards cracked under his feet. Most beings who faced this environment collapsed within hours from exposure, but Alex did not panic. He immediately dropped low and dug into the snow with his bare hands, creating a shallow pit to shield himself from the wind. He then lined the hollow with leaves and branches he had carried in his sling, using his own body heat to create insulation. It was crude, but it gave him shelter. For food, he studied the icy ground and found strange fish-like creatures swimming beneath a frozen stream. He broke the ice with a stone and used another branch as a crude spear. After a few failed attempts, he adapted his grip and angle, finally catching one. He roasted it slowly over a small fire sparked by friction, refusing to waste even the scales. Every move he made was not random, but chosen with thought and patience. The aliens watched in disbelief, for most challengers had given up long before, even attempting fire in the tundra. Alex had done it within the first cycle. As the hours passed, he began to notice flaws in the tundra as well. The fish regenerated too quickly, the snowstorms cycled on a pattern rather than true randomness, and the cold, though biting, never grew worse than a set level. Alex realized then that the designers had made a mistake. They had created an ordeal, so strict in its patterns that a mind quick enough could learn its language. He whispered to himself that once you knew the rhythm of suffering, you could outlast it. Meanwhile, the council chamber grew tense. The delegates whispered angrily, claiming the simulation must be malfunctioning. But the insectoid announcer shook his head and confirmed that everything functioned as designed. It was not the system that was failing. It was their assumptions about humanity that were unraveling. The human was bending the simulation to his will by refusing to treat it as endless torment, and instead, as a solvable code. By the time night returned, Alex had a secure pit shelter, a supply of roasted fish, and a mental map of the tundra's cycles. He sat quietly, staring into the artificial fire, and considered his next step. Already he had survived desert, jungle, and ice within hours, where others had barely lasted through one environment. He was beginning to sense that the simulation, no matter how vast, had limits. If he could keep exploiting its patterns, he might not just survive but control it. He clenched his fists and whispered that the test would not break him. It would be broken instead. Back in the Great Hall, silence fell as the timer reached another milestone. The aliens who had once laughed at humanity were no longer smiling. They leaned forward with unease, knowing deep down that the ordeal meant to last years was already beginning to bend under the weight of a human mind that refused to quit. The cold winds faded, and the tundra dissolved into shifting light as the simulation restructured itself again, and Alex found himself standing in a vast canyon of jagged stone. The walls stretched high above him like the ribs of some ancient beast, and the ground was cracked with deep fissures that hissed with steam rising from below. Heat rolled up from the cracks, and the air shimmered with the smell of minerals and fire. Many who had reached this stage had perished quickly from the sudden extremes, their bodies collapsing under the pressure of heat after enduring cold. But Alex crouched low, pressed his hand against the ground, and felt the rhythm of the steam bursts. He realized that the cracks exhaled like living lungs on a cycle that repeated every few minutes. If he timed it correctly, he could use the bursts to cook food or even propel objects, and the thought filled him with excitement rather than dread. The alien council watched the scene with grim silence. The canyon had been designed as a final punishment to break minds that had survived the first stages. The heat and noise disoriented. The predators here were stone-skinned beasts that could camouflage themselves perfectly against the walls. Yet as one of the massive beasts emerged with grinding steps, its stone claws tearing grooves in the rock, Alex did not panic. He studied the way its skin blended, the way its breathing shook small pebbles loose from the walls. He bent low, gathered shards of sharp rock, and placed them in patterns near the fissures. When the beast approached, the steam burst erupted and startled it, just as Alex had predicted. The distraction gave him time to hurl a shard into its softer joint where the stone plates shifted. The creature bellowed and retreated, more out of confusion than pain, and Alex grinned faintly to himself. He was not fighting for dominance. He was testing the rules. Every move revealed that the system was predictable in ways its makers had not intended. Hours passed within the canyon as Alex fashioned crude tools from the rocks. He shaped one into a hammer and another into a wedge, using them to break open smaller fissures that released controlled steam. He roasted the remains of strange creatures that wandered too close, refusing to waste anything. With each action, he mapped the patterns of the canyon, and in his mind he began to see the simulation not as a hostile environment, but as a flawed machine. It repeated itself too perfectly. The bursts of steam never varied more than a second. The predators moved in fixed ranges. Even the shadows cast by the towering walls shifted in a rhythm that could be predicted. The human whispered to himself that this was not chaos at all, but order disguised as chaos. Back in the council hall, the alien scientists grew restless. A reptilian delegate slammed his claw against the table, demanding that the designers explain how the human had survived this long. The insectoid announcer responded with quiet firmness that the system had not failed. The test was functioning exactly as intended, but humanity's way of thinking was outside the parameters they had predicted. Instead of breaking, the human adapted faster than the simulation could crush him. Whispers spread through the chamber as the timer continued climbing higher than ever before in recorded history. The canyon shifted again as the simulation twisted into a storm world. Clouds, swirling overhead with violent winds that lashed the ground with sheets of acid rain. Lightning forked across the sky and struck the rock with blinding flashes. The ground shook with thunder and every instinct screamed for shelter. Alex moved quickly, dragging shards of stone into a hollow he had dug against the canyon wall. He layered the walls with slabs to redirect the rain and dug trenches to drain the flow away from his position. His body ached. His hands were blistered and bleeding, but his eyes were sharp with determination. He had grown up in a world that demanded endurance against storms, deserts, and mountains. This artificial nightmare was only another landscape to outlast. When the worst of the storm subsided, he stepped out and studied the land. He noticed that the lightning always struck in clusters, repeating at the same points, another flaw in the system. He placed stone markers in those locations and avoided them, using the knowledge to cross the canyon more safely. By the time night fell again, he had turned the simulation's greatest dangers into manageable obstacles. The council chamber was no longer filled with casual observers, but with tense silence. Delegates leaned forward, realizing that the ordeal built to last year's was already bending under the weight of one human's stubborn logic. Some muttered in fear that if a single human could dismantle their most perfect trial, what else could humanity achieve if given more time and more freedom? The insectoid scholar who had once announced the rules now bowed his head slightly and admitted that the council might be witnessing not the failure of a simulation, but the beginning of a lesson none of them had wanted to learn. Inside the canyon, Alex rested again, his body trembling with exhaustion but his mind sharper than ever. He had survived desert, jungle, tundra, and canyon within hours where others had perished in days. He knew the simulation would continue to evolve, but he also knew its weakness. Every system had limits, and every design could be understood. He whispered into the storm-filled night that he would not only finish the test but break its pride. For humanity, survival was never just about endurance. It was about turning every challenge into a new weapon. And as he closed his eyes, he smiled faintly, ready for the next stage that awaited him. The moment Alex opened his eyes again, the world had changed. The canyon walls and the storming skies dissolved into a strange metallic landscape that shimmered with unnatural light. It was no longer a natural environment but a machine world of endless corridors, shifting floors and traps that snapped shut with razor-sharp precision. The alien designers had built this stage as the Mindbreaker, a place where challengers became lost in endless repetition, where hunger and thirst gnawed while the corridors twisted and reset in impossible loops. No one had lasted more than a day in this stage, their minds collapsing long before their bodies. Yet Alex did not panic when the floor reformed under his feet. He crouched and touched the surface with his hands, feeling the faint vibration of gears below, listening for patterns. He quickly realized the corridors were not truly endless but were resetting themselves in timed sequences. He marked the walls with scratches using a jagged piece of metal he pried loose from the floor. When the corridors shifted, his marks vanished, yet the rhythm of the resets stayed constant. He began to count under his breath, using each breath as a measure of time, and soon understood that the maze was only a program repeating itself. The council chamber grew heated as the delegates leaned closer to the monitors. One of the elder delegates from the crystalline species muttered that the human should already be screaming in despair. The machine world was designed for psychological torment, a labyrinth of futility. But Alex was not pacing in circles or breaking down. He was calm, systematic, and strangely focused, like a craftsman dissecting a puzzle. He stopped at each reset, crouched low, and mapped the direction the corridors took. He then began to test how far he could move before the reset triggered again. Bit by bit, he charted invisible boundaries in his head, turning what seemed like madness into order. When hunger struck, Alex scoured the metallic halls and found vents that released bursts of warm air. He reasoned that heat meant energy, and energy meant some hidden source. He pried open one of the vents and discovered strange, rodent-like creatures with metallic hides nesting near the warmth. Most challengers had never even seen them, too consumed by despair. Alex snapped one with his hands, used a sharp edge of metal to tear it open, and found its body contained a jelly-like substance that, while bitter, gave him strength. He cooked it by holding it close to a vent until the heat thickened the jelly. It was crude, but it was food. Back in the chamber, the alien scientists hissed and argued. Some claimed the simulation was malfunctioning, but the insectoid announcer declared again that everything was functioning within design. The problem was not the system. The problem was that humanity approached it differently. Where others saw chaos, the humans saw patterns. Where others saw torment, the humans saw opportunity. As the hours passed, Alex began to push further, noticing that the machine world shifted not only in space but in light. The corridors glowed brighter just before each reset. He learned to time his movements so that he could slip through junctions just before they shifted, effectively bypassing the loop. Soon, he reached chambers none of the other species had ever glimpsed. In one chamber, he found tall constructs that resembled guardians, humanoid machines with burning eyes. They stepped forward to block his path, their arms transforming into blades. Alex did not attempt to overpower them, for he knew that would be suicide. Instead, he studied their movements and noticed that they too operated on cycles, their steps and strikes repeating in a rhythm. He waited, shifted his body in sync, and moved through their gaps without taking a single strike. The machines continued swinging long after he had passed, unaware that he had slipped between their rules. The council erupted in disbelief as the human cleared the guardian chamber with nothing but timing and patience. Entire civilizations had lost their champions to those guardians, torn apart within minutes. Yet the human had made them irrelevant. The insectoid announcer whispered with awe that humanity was not playing the game at all. Humanity was rewriting the rules. When Alex finally reached the center of the machine world, he found a vast glowing sphere suspended above a pit. Energy pulsed through it like a heartbeat, and he knew instinctively that this was the core of the stage. He tested the edges of the pit, threw a piece of metal into it, and watched as the sphere flared brighter for an instant before returning to its rhythm. He realized the sphere was monitoring everything and adjusting the simulation. It was not indestructible, only reactive. He smiled faintly, his lips cracked from thirst, his body battered but his spirit unshaken. He sat cross-legged before the sphere, watching its pulse, whispering to himself that he had already won because he understood its language. Outside, the delegates grew silent as the timer reached numbers that none had believed possible. Their proudest creation was unraveling not over years but in mere hours, and as Alex stared at the heart of the machine, the council could no longer deny the truth. The survival simulation had not been designed to measure humanity. Humanity had been designed by nature itself to survive anything, even the arrogance of the galaxy's greatest trial. The council could not remain calm any longer. The machine world that had humbled empires was bending under the will of a single human, and whispers spread among the delegates like wildfire. Some called for the simulation to be terminated before their failure became undeniable, but others insisted that the difficulty could still be raised. The alien scientists who had built the test whispered commands into their consoles, and layers of hidden programs activated. The simulation trembled as entire protocols that had never been used before came online. If Alex had broken the patterns of the normal ordeal, then the architects would unleash something no challenger had ever seen. Horrors stored in reserve to ensure no one could claim mastery. The metallic corridors shattered apart, and Alex suddenly stood in a nightmare landscape where the rules of physics seemed to twist against him. Gravity shifted without warning, pulling him sideways toward cliffs of floating stone. The ground beneath his feet melted into liquid and then hardened again. His ears rang with voices that were not his own, whispers pressing into his mind, trying to break his concentration. Most beings would have fallen into madness within minutes, but Alex dug his nails into his palms and forced his thoughts into order. He had endured fear before. He had endured loneliness, and he recognized that these whispers were only programs written to shake him. He laughed once, a sharp sound in the chaos, and said aloud that no program knew the human mind well enough to tear it apart. Creatures emerged from the broken horizon, Not animals, but shifting shapes of shadow with claws that stretched like spears. They moved without rhythm, their forms unstable, their attacks unpredictable. The council watched with grim satisfaction, certain that this would end the humans' run. Yet Alex did not fight wildly. He retreated, studied, and noted that even the chaos had limits. The shadows struck hardest when the whispers in his mind were loudest. He realized then that the simulation was linking the environment to his state of mind. If he calmed his breathing, if he steadied his thoughts, the shadows slowed. He began to meditate in the middle of battle, lowering his heart rate, controlling his fear. The shadows faltered, their claws shrinking, their forms dissolving. By mastering himself, he mastered them. The chamber of the council filled with silence and then outrage. Delegates pounded their tables, demanding explanations. The designers insisted the system was at full strength. There was nothing left to unleash, and yet the human was still advancing. The insectoid announcer, voice trembling with a mixture of awe and fear, declared that humanity had turned survival into something the galaxy had never seen before. Survival not by brute strength, but by turning weakness itself into a weapon. Inside the nightmare realm, Alex pressed onward. The floating cliffs connected by bridges of bone and glass led him to a colossal structure of shifting towers. Each tower bent and twisted as though alive, and in the windows he saw faces, thousands of them, screaming silently. This was meant to break him, to drown him in despair, but he forced himself to walk through the halls with steady steps. He reached out and touched the walls and whispered that he had seen death before, that humanity had always lived beside suffering, and that nothing here was new. The walls trembled at his words as if the program itself could not comprehend defiance in the face of horror. The designers increased the cycle again, hurling storms of fire, rivers of acid, and swarms of mechanical hunters into his path. Alex adapted to each with the same patience. He timed the firestorms by the flashes in the clouds. He redirected the acid rivers with trenches carved by shards of stone, and he turned the hunters against one another by throwing metal scraps to trigger their sensors. Every obstacle became a tool, every horror became a lesson. Hours passed outside, but inside Alex was moving with a momentum no one could stop. By the end of that stage, he stood atop the tallest tower, looking out over the broken nightmare, his body bleeding and exhausted but his spirit burning bright. He realized he was not just surviving anymore. He was dismantling the pride of the galaxy. He raised his fist toward the sky and whispered that humanity did not measure survival in years or decades. Humanity measured survival in the refusal to yield, no matter how impossible the odds. In the chamber, the council no longer argued. They stared in silence at the timer and at the human who had reduced their most terrifying illusions into stepping stones. The ordeal that had been designed to last years had now been unraveled in mere hours, and the delegates began to feel the weight of something greater than a failed test. They were beginning to understand that this was not just about one man named Alex. This was about humanity itself, and the truth that no design could hold them forever. The nightmare world shattered like glass around Alex, and he was thrown into darkness before the simulation rebuilt itself. When the light returned, he was no longer in a landscape of deserts, jungles, or machines, but in a place that looked like a vast city stretching into infinity. Towers of metal and crystal rose high above him, their walls pulsing with energy, and streets twisted in impossible ways with bridges that curved upside down and doors that opened into empty air. This was no longer an environment for survival. This was the heart of the simulation itself. The designers had stripped away the illusion of wilderness and exposed the raw system where every element was connected. To any other challenger, this sight would have been madness, a reminder that nothing was real. But to Alex, it was confirmation of what he had already suspected. The simulation was only a machine, and every machine could be understood. He walked through the city and watched carefully. The towers pulsed with light in repeating patterns, and the streets shifted at timed intervals like clockwork. He marked his path with scratches on the stone as he had done before, and found that though the streets changed, they always returned to the same configuration eventually. The city was vast, but not infinite, only a loop of endless design. He realized then that the designers had not expected anyone to reach this point, so they had not bothered to hide the repeating structures. Alex crouched at a junction and closed his eyes, counting heartbeats and listening to the rhythm of the towers. Slowly, he built a map in his mind. A map of pulses and resets. A map that led him deeper toward the center. The council chamber was silent now. The delegates no longer argued because there was nothing left to say. They could only watch as the human moved through the heart of their greatest creation, as though it were a maze in a child's puzzle book. The insectoid announcer whispered that Alex was not surviving anymore. He was rewriting the ordeal into his own story. The reptilian commander who had mocked humanity earlier lowered his gaze in silence. As Alex pressed deeper into the city, he encountered guardians unlike anything he had seen before. They were tall figures of light, shifting constantly, their bodies formed of pure energy. They moved with speed beyond sight and struck with weapons of pure force that could shatter stone. Alex knew he could not fight them directly, so he studied them as he had studied everything else. He noticed that their steps hummed in harmony with the towers. They were bound to the same cycles, their movements linked to the rhythm of the city. He began to move in sync with the pulses, stepping only when the towers dimmed, pausing when they brightened. The guardians swung at shadows, while Alex slipped past them untouched. He realized they were not hunters but programs, blind to anything outside their script. In the chamber of the council, the alien scientists could barely speak as they watched the human bend their guardians into irrelevance. Delegates muttered that if humanity could break this test, perhaps their fleets could break wars. Perhaps their explorers could break the unknown. Fear spread among them. Fear not of failure, but of what it meant for humanity to exist in their galaxy at all. Inside the simulation, Alex reached a chamber unlike the rest. It was a hall of mirrors, each mirror reflecting not his body, but possible failures. He saw himself starving, drowning, burning, freezing, screaming in madness. It was the final trick, an attempt to break him with the weight of despair. He stood still for a long moment, then raised his fist and smashed the closest mirror. It shattered into shards of light, and when the reflections faded, he spoke aloud into the hall. He told the simulation that humanity had always known failure, had always faced death. But survival was not the absence of failure. It was the refusal to stop moving. His words echoed through the chamber, and the other mirrors dimmed, powerless before conviction. The council gasped as alarms flared across their consoles. The human was not only surviving, he was overriding the code itself. His defiance created feedback loops the designers had never predicted. Systems rerouted, guardians froze, entire sectors collapsed. Alex pressed on until he reached the core of the city, a vast sphere of light that pulsed like a star. He stood before it, body battered, blood streaking his arms, but his eyes burned with clarity. He placed his hands on the sphere and whispered that survival was no longer enough. He would master this world. And as his voice echoed, the sphere pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. Back in the council hall, the monitors flickered wildly. The simulation that had endured for centuries under their control was bending, reshaping itself around one human. Delegates stood in shock, some trembling, others in denial. But none could change what they saw. Humanity was no longer a participant in their trial. Humanity had become its master. Alex stood before the glowing core of the simulation, his body weary but his mind sharper than ever. Every muscle ached, every breath burned, but he felt no hesitation. The light pulsed with a rhythm he now understood, the heartbeat of the entire trial, and he let himself move in sync with it. He realized then that the simulation was not simply a test of endurance, not merely a maze of traps and monsters. It was a system built to measure adaptability, to quantify patience, to push any species to the limits of comprehension. But humans were not content to be measured or contained. Humans improvised, humans created, humans turned rules into tools and fear into fuel. Alex was about to show the architects of this trial what it truly meant to survive and dominate. He pressed his hands against the sphere, and instantly it reacted. Lights flared and shadows twisted, the entire simulation responding to his presence, as though it were a living thing recognizing its master. The guardians that had once stalked him now froze mid-step, their energy forms quivering, unsure of how to act. Towers of impossible geometry bent, reshaped, and then folded into patterns Alex had never seen before, but somehow instinctively understood. He felt the flow of information, a river of code and rules, logic and physics, all interwoven in a language he did not know he could read. Yet he did. He moved with confidence, pushing boundaries, bending the simulation, and rewriting outcomes in real time. Every obstacle was no longer a threat, but a stepping stone. Every trap a lesson in exploiting the system rather than succumbing to it. The Alien Council watched in disbelief as the screens before them began to collapse under the sheer audacity of what Alex was accomplishing. The insectoid announcer stammered, its voice cracking, and even the most seasoned commanders could only gape as their lifetimes of study and trial unraveled in moments. Systems designed to last decades to test, torment, and predict every conceivable move were being nullified by one human's intuition and relentless drive. Debates turned to panic, whispers to cries, yet Alex never paused. He had understood the simulation on a level the designers had never anticipated. Their own pride had blinded them to the simplest truth about humanity. Humans did not merely survive. They innovated under pressure. They turned limitation into advantage, and they found paths where none existed. Within the simulation, the city of impossible towers and streets folded into itself. The hall of mirrors dissolved into streams of light, and the guardians flickered out of existence one by one. Alex advanced to the final threshold, a colossal gateway of energy and raw code that hummed with power and threatened to overwhelm any who approached. He could feel it testing him, weighing his spirit against the algorithms of eternity. And yet he smiled. This was the culmination of everything he had learned. Every trial, every calculated risk, every moment of despair that had sharpened him into something more than a survivor. He stepped forward, merging his will with the energy, and whispered a command that was both declaration and proof. Humanity does not wait. Humanity does not falter. Humanity moves. The reaction was immediate. The core pulsed once, twice, and then exploded in radiant waves that swept across the simulation, collapsing timelines, bending space, and dissolving constructs. Alex remained standing, untouched by the chaos, a human at the center of what had been built to crush him. Around him, the simulation reformed not as a trap, but as a blank slate, responsive to his intent. He realized then that he could end it. He could claim victory. He could demonstrate not only survival but mastery. With a final thought, he dismantled the remaining walls, disarmed the last of the guardians, and watched as the city dissolved into light and then into nothing, leaving only him and the pulse of the core beneath his feet. On the Alien Council, chaos erupted. Delegates fell silent as their consoles went dark, screens blank, systems unresponsive. One by one, the implications struck them. The test built to last for years had been completed in hours, but more than completion, it had been conquered. Humanity had not merely survived. Humanity had dominated, bending the very logic of the simulation to its own will. Insects, reptiles, and beings of pure thought alike realized that the measures they had built to understand humans were insufficient. Their predictions flawed, their assumptions shattered. Alex finally turned, his chest heaving and eyes blazing with the clarity of triumph. He had walked through years of terror and trial in mere hours, not by cheating, not by running, but by thinking, adapting, and refusing to yield. The simulation was over, but its lessons were immortal. A human did not merely endure. A human defined the parameters of survival itself. The council had no words, no solutions, no defenses left. They stared at the aftermath of their creation, a human standing victorious where centuries of planning had failed. Alex looked at the glowing remnants of the core, his voice firm as he spoke aloud not to the simulation but to the galaxy. Humanity cannot be underestimated, humanity cannot be contained, and humanity will always find a way. And with that, the pulse faded. The city vanished, and Alex walked out of the simulation into the real world, leaving the council to comprehend the staggering truth that humans had rewritten the rules, shattered the impossible, and emerged as the species that no trial, no matter how sophisticated, could ever defeat. Alex emerged from the simulation chamber, his body humming with exhaustion, yet his mind sharper than ever. The air around him smelled of burnt circuitry and ionized energy. But he did not notice his eyes were fixed on the observation deck where the alien council gathered in stunned silence. They had expected a struggle that would last for years. Endless calculations and predictions had been made to anticipate every possible move, but none of their data had accounted for what a human could. To Alex felt a rush of adrenaline that was more than survival. It was triumph. It was proof that every rule they had written, every algorithm they had built, could be bent by creativity and sheer willpower. He could feel the echoes of the simulation, still thrumming beneath his feet. The city of impossible geometry and the guardians of light dissolved, now leaving a calm emptiness that pulsed with the memory of what had been conquered. He walked slowly toward the council, their faces a mixture of disbelief, awe, and fear. They realized that in trying to contain a human, they had underestimated a species that thrived on the unpredictable and turned chaos into strategy. Every heartbeat of humanity was a question mark, every thought a potential solution. And Alex embodied all of that. He raised his head and spoke in a voice that resonated through the chamber, not asking for recognition but demanding understanding. Humanity survives. Humanity adapts. Humanity conquers. The council tried to respond, but the words stuck in their throats. Every plan they had made, every prediction, every simulation had been shattered in hours, not years, and it was not luck. It was instinct, ingenuity, and a refusal to submit. Alex turned and walked toward the exit. The lights of the simulation chamber flickered and then faded. The technology that had been meant to test him now stood silent. A monument to human resilience behind him, the council remained frozen in contemplation of what they had witnessed. And across the galaxy, whispers spread quickly of a human who had beaten the ultimate test, a human who had finished in hours. What was designed to break species had been mastered by one. Alex felt the weight of what he had done, but also a calm clarity. He had proven a truth that no simulation could erase. Humanity was never meant to follow rules. It was meant to define them. He stepped outside into the sunlight of the real world, feeling the warmth on his skin and the limitless potential ahead of him. For the first time in the long hours of the trial, he smiled, knowing that the story of this victory would echo across stars and species and time, and nothing could ever undo the fact that one human had done what centuries of planning could. Not the end.